Welcome to Spotlight. U.S. lawmakers have passed a record $858 billion annual military spending bill. The unprecedented package is $45 billion more than what President Joe Biden had requested. The bill has allocated billions in producing major weapons systems as well as military aid to Ukraine and Taiwan. In this edition of Spotlight, we'll discuss the reasons behind the rise in the U.S. military budget while Americans are embroiled in economic hardship and the consequences of Washington's continuing military support for Ukraine and Taiwan. Joining us on Spotlight, we have activist and commentator DeBar, joining us from Austin, New York. And we also have anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition, Richard Becker, joining us from San Francisco. Well, gentlemen, welcome to the program. Let's start off with Mr. DeBar. The U.S. Senate, as we know, has passed next year's defense bill authorizing a record $858 billion in annual military spending. Share with us your perspective on this record-breaking bill, also known as the NDAA.
Well, it's the largest budget of any kind in the history of the world. You can start with that. The U.S. Military budget is the largest single component of the federal budget. And it's by four times, I think, 3 or 4 times factor larger than the next largest military budget, which is a budget that's carried on the backs of 1.8 billion people in China, as opposed to 350 million people or 340 million people in the United States. It supports a network, basically a global occupation army that occupies Europe, occupies parts of Asia, Japan particularly, and South Korea, so-called. It occupies a good part of Africa by proxy through AFRICOM and directly. Of course, it occupies the living hell out of the United States. And it absorbs much of the effort also in research and development, technology, and other things. It is not only the elephant in the room, but the elephant and the room and everyone else in it. And it is essentially this diversion of resources that could be feeding, clothing, providing shelter and medical care and education to people who are sorely in need of it around the world, even in the United States. Instead, it's spent on a mission whose ultimate expression would be the extinction of humanity. So I don't know what else to say other than to just describe it in naked terms and let people draw their own conclusions. Other than one word I would say is criminal.
Richard Becker, what are your thoughts on the ever-rising military budget of the U.S.?
Well, it's a real obscenity. And, you know, I think between the time of 9/11, September 11th in 2001, and over the next 20 years, the best estimates are that at least $20 trillion was spent on war and militarism during that time. And I think that's probably a conservative estimate. But these funds, these unthinkable, unimaginable funds, I think it's very hard for us to even begin to wrap our minds around what these kind of numbers mean. $858 billion, how does one calculate that? But it certainly does, its purpose is not to protect the people of the United States. There's nobody threatening the United States. I mean, there's no country that would be so wild and out of control that it would do that. It's to really support the empire. And it is an empire. It's a worldwide empire. And it's kept in power and in place by militarism, by the military. The U.S. is slipping in many ways as far as its being the dominant world power when it comes to economics and finance and diplomacy and so forth, but it still is by far the world's leading military power. It's not something to be proud of. And it's also not something that is accurately reported. The 858 billion, as far as I know, does not include the Central Intelligence Agency. Last year, the Congress gave Central Intelligence Agency and the other intelligence agencies 25 billion more than they asked for. So there was about $85 billion more than that. In the Department of Energy budget, Department of Energy is hidden away there, and not very completely hidden, but money for nuclear weapons, billions and billions of dollars more for nuclear weapons. And so, you know, a great deal of the budget, the overall budget of the United States, really more than half of the discretionary budget of the United States goes to militarism. And at a time when there is great need and great suffering around the world and inside the United States, and the fundamental problems of lack of health care, adequate housing, adequate food and clean water, a clean environment, these problems could be addressed and overcome if those kind of funds were spent not on war, but on meeting the needs of the people of this country and the world.
Don DeBar, the bill also provides Ukraine with additional security assistance in its war with Russia, $800 million to be exact. It also includes a range of provisions to aid Taiwan amid tensions with China. On the issue of Ukraine, is the plan to stretch this war out for as long as possible?
I think that's really a tactical question that I don't know the answer to, because the strategic objective, they've been pretty clear about it, is to basically regime change in Russia and a dismantling of the Russian Federation. They are now openly talking about this at the State Department, and they are actively holding public fora in various places with groups that they hold out as repressed nationalities in the Russian Federation, you know, building basically quote-unquote liberation movements. They're doing, or trying to do, what was done to the Soviet Union in 1991. I believe some people in policy-making positions there have the illusion or the delusion that they're going to be able to recreate 1991 and have the Russian Federation collapse and be dismantled by making war. However, there are some steps that are being taken now that are intrinsically escalatory, that have a much sharper curve towards, you know, total war basically between Russia and the U.S. and its puppet states in Europe. And we're talking now about the delivery of Patriot missiles, warnings from Russia that if you have Patriot missile batteries targeting our aircraft, we're going to be taking them out. The U.S., of course, would have American soldiers and military personnel and civilian personnel, you know, operating those batteries. And so there will be American casualties as a direct result of direct retaliatory strikes by Russia. This goes nowhere but directly to World War III in full. And that seems to be happening pretty quickly at the moment.
Richard Becker, amid rising tensions with China, this bill has allocated billions in defense support for Taiwan, as well as a fast-tracked weapons procurement. Now, a think tank senior advisor says it would also create a regional contingency stockpile, which would allow the Pentagon to put weapons in Taiwan for use if a military conflict with China arises. Now, have the consequences of such measures been thought through, in your opinion?
I think they have been thought through by the policymakers, by the people who are carrying out this policy in Asia, in the Indo-Pac, as they call it, command. You know, it's not discussed a lot, but part of the strategy, and this was explained by the outgoing Admiral Philip Davidson, who was the head of the Indo-Pac Command last year when he was leaving office. And he said, you know, the first island chain countries have to be prepared not only for war, but for redundancy. And that was a very interesting statement, I thought. In other words, and this first island chain means Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, Borneo, and possibly other countries. But what he was saying, and I think this continues down till today, is that they have to be built up militarily so that even if a war occurs, and of course it's in anticipation of a war with China, that they'll get hit, they'll suffer casualties and destruction, and that's fine from the U.S. policymakers' point of view. But what they have to do is they have to be able to be redundant, meaning that they have to have so much weaponry that they can continue fighting or continuing serving as the bases for the United States to continue the war against China until victory. So, and it's important to point this out because on the one hand, it shows there's no concern whatsoever for the people of those countries or the people of China. This is, it's cold-blooded approach to war. And also that this kind of planning means that the United States is disregarding the Shanghai Communique, and they have been for quite some time now. Shanghai Communique was signed 50 years ago in 1972, recognizing that there was, and it said, on both sides of the strait, everyone recognizes that there's one China. Now the U.S. is treating Taiwan not as part of China, and it hasn't been, as I said, for a while. It is treating it as a completely independent country that is an ally and a military ally, most important of all, to the United States. Very, very dangerous.
Don DeBar, Washington is not shying away from cranking up tensions with China, but the repercussions of that, like with the situation similar in Ukraine, it could be devastating.
Yeah. And the real scary thing is, well, there's a couple of things that are going on. In addition to what Richard just said, by the way, there's been an ongoing, practice to remilitarize Japan, both in terms of armament and also in terms of mission, because they're now talking about having Japan more or less patrol on behalf of the alliance, quote unquote, certain areas where they'd be facing down China. With the history of that, that's a pretty frightening thought all by itself. But you have a situation in Washington where, let's say, looking at Ukraine, Bernie Sanders, or no, that was even Yemen, it wasn't even Ukraine. Bernie Sanders is talking about trying to, call up the War Powers resolution on the Congress, and he can't do it even on Yemen. Instead, you have an 83-11 majority in the Senate for this, for the budget and for these policies where they're beefing up Taiwan for a war with China. So it's kind of hard to figure out where the political breaks would be on the march to the gallop towards war, almost on every front. They're fighting in Africa in 5 or 6 different places, and even someone is tried to assassinate. I don't know his status at this point. At one of the Russian staff people in the Central African Republic. You've got, of course, Ukraine war, Yemen war, the chest thumping in Asia around both Korea and China with the United States and South Korea and Japan, and they're increasing the budget by 5% more than they asked for, and the request was a record. I don't know how you find breaks inside the political system or inside even a legal construct to put on this thing that looks like it's going to be a global war. It's maturing in front of our eyes.
Sure. Richard, Becker, let's turn our focus now to inside the United States. Doesn't the average U.S. citizen think that there are more pressing issues other than overseas military spending? The country continues to be hit by exceptionally high inflation, with almost every other major economic indicator also being mired in long-term problems.
Well, yes, there's been a very intensive and extensive propaganda campaign inside the United States in support of the U.S. NATO proxy war in Ukraine. And I think that this is something that, has affected the population because it's so incredibly one-sided. It's so one-sided that, we had a couple months ago, the members of the Progressive Caucus in Congress sent a letter to President Biden. And the letter said, oh, we salute you. And it wasn't even anti-war. It was like, we salute you for the war effort, the military aid to Ukraine and so forth. I mean, really kind of disgraceful for people who are supposed to be anti-war. But they said then, well, but, maybe we could also have negotiations. And there was a huge response to that from not only the Biden administration, and not only by the Republicans, but by the leaders of the Democrats in Congress. And they retracted the letter in one day. And I bring this up because it shows how intense the propaganda campaign for the Ukraine war. And the Ukraine war, it's a terrible war. And it's a war between peoples who just a little over 3 decades ago were part of the same country, and who share a lot in the way of the history and culture and religion, language, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's very tragic that it's taking place. Having said that, it is clear that it was the U.S. and NATO, and particularly the U.S., that refused any negotiations ahead of time that could have staved off this crisis. It could have avoided this crisis and this war. And that's where the primary responsibility lies. They've surrounded Russia to a large degree, or European Russia, with their military allies, and they were trying to complete it by bringing in Ukraine, which would have been the most devastating to Russia's national security, to have NATO in Ukraine, and NATO weaponry in Ukraine. So, there's been all the propaganda, and it's, washed over people, but we in the anti-war movement here, we're planning activities next month around the time of the Martin Luther King Day commemorations, remembering King's opposition to the war in Vietnam and to wars around the world, and highlighting that. And, we have to reach out to the population and try to counter the propaganda to the greatest extent possible.
Don DeBar, putting into question the timing of this bill, the U.S. national debt, if I'm correct, now stands at around $31 trillion. Does this show basically how threatened Washington could be by the major economic powers which are emerging, and with it, an emerging multipolar world?
Well, the first thing it shows is the priorities of the people who make the budget. People in the United States are more housing distressed, healthcare distressed, food distressed, just about everything, infrastructure distressed, as they've been in decades. And it's deteriorating on the back of inflation that's eating away at whatever money people have aside or in their pocket, and also just in terms of the dismantling of entire economic nodes, supply lines and all of this. And that is becoming institutionalized. In other words, it's just a continuing degrading of the condition of people in the United States. And it also shows that they do, of course, take note of the rising multipolarity in the world. And they are, rather than sitting back and trying to engage it and saying, okay, well, we could be first among peers or something along those lines, and satisfy themselves with being sort of president of a college of the rulers of the world, they're going for the gusto, and they're willing to blow up the world. They're showing us that they're willing to go to the brink in order to accomplish that, and they're spending the money on the weapons that can do it, and they're starting to use them.
Richard Becker, U.S. senators backed the bill by an overwhelming 83-11 bipartisan majority. There's a lot of talk about the great divide in U.S. politics, but politicians, they can still produce bipartisan consensus when it's needed. And there's always consensus on wars and military spending in America. Am I right?
There's always consensus on the war. I mean, it's only in the most extreme conditions where the war has been lost, like in the last years of the Vietnam War, that there's real opposition and even rejection at some points of military budgets. But other than that, year in, year out, You know, we hear how, you know, difficult it is to get anything good for the people through the Congress, how we, you know, but then when the military budget time comes around, it's like it just almost automatic that it goes through. And the corporate mass media in the United States is very linked to the also to the military industrial corporations and the banks, and they're all linked together and with the oil companies, and they benefit from this. They benefit from war. They are the beneficiaries of this military policy, and everybody else constitute the losers when it comes to militarism.
And same question to you, Mr. DeBar. Disagreements on issues like guns, abortion, healthcare, but it seems like the partisan bickering and infighting, the line is drawn when it comes to the issue of militarism.
You know, you can have disagreements about all of those issues, and before you decide who's right and who's wrong, find that all of the people who are arguing end up as radioactive wisps of steam. And then how significant are these other issues in the face of that? And that is where we're at.
All right, I guess we're going to wrap it up. Any final thoughts from you, Mr. DeBar?
Yeah, just in general, the resources that are being expended right now could be used to house and clothe and feed half the population of the world that's in severe distress over those things, including the 9 or 10 or 12 million people that will die of starvation this year alone. These are products of U.S. foreign policy and of the U.S. budget process that could be resolved with one person in the White House with executive power exercising that, or a Congress that has some human beings in it instead of a bunch of vampires.
Richard Becker, would you like to add anything to that? Final comments?
No, I'd like to concur with that comment, and I'd also like to say that I think if people want to see where all the money is going, Google U.S. military commands worldwide or something like that, and see this incredible situation that has never existed before in human history, where the whole world is encompassed in the military commands of one country. I mean, it's amazing and it's disgraceful, and it's really holds the possibility for the destruction of humanity.
All right, on that note, we're going to wrap up tonight's Spotlight. Thanks to activist and commentator Don DeBar, joining us from Waukegan, New York, and Richard Becker, anti-war activist from the Answer Coalition, joining us from San Francisco. And a special thanks to our viewers for staying with us on tonight's Spotlight. It's good night for now, and see you next time.